Can we start with the American-Israeli attack on Iran this week? Irrespective of the legal arguments, was this attack justified?
Well, I think the legal arguments are central to justification. War has laws as well, and it is for the Americans to set out their legal basis for the actions that they're taking in the Middle East. We've taken a decision ourselves as a country based on our national interest, that is not to get involved in the offensive action that has taken place. But of course, now that the Iranian regime is lashing out and our own citizens need security and for us to maintain their safety, we've obviously engaged in the defensive action. So we've got a clear basis on which we are acting. The wider sort of legal basis, I think that is for the Americans and the Israelis to set out.
Well, you say the legal issues are at the centre of it, but for many people, including, I suspect, many of your constituents, it's a moral question, and the answer you've just given me might put you at odds with them, who see this as Donald Trump attacking a Muslim nation. How are you going to explain your support for this weekend when you meet them?
Well, I think that we've taken decisions that are in the British national interest. We weren't involved in those initial strikes. But, of course, we have a responsibility to protect our citizens across the Middle East. We have hundreds of thousands of British citizens in the Middle East. We have our own bases. We have our military service personnel. We have a duty to protect our people. And so we've engaged in the defensive action in order to do that. I actually think that's broadly in line with where British public opinion is. People do understand, of course, if we've got our, servicemen and women abroad, we've got a duty to keep our people safe, and that is what we are doing. I don't think that the broader question on morality and the law can be so easily disaggregated, as it were.
Are you happy to see the passing of the Ayatollah Khamenei?
I don't think it's a passing that I'm going to be mourning. I don't think anybody really is going to be mourning the passing of the Ayatollah when you understand what this regime has been doing, the threat that it has posed to citizens here at home, and the destruction of their own people. We know that many thousands of protesters have lost their lives in Iran over the last few months.
I know, but you and your colleagues have used this expression, nobody's going to shed tears. I suppose what I'm really asking is, do you think that the fact that he is no longer there in that position is a good thing for the Middle East and for the wider world?
Well, I think in terms of what happens next, that remains to be seen in terms of the regime that follows. The regime, as it currently stands, is able to continue. That is why they remain, lashing out across the Middle East with the action that they are taking.
The Prime Minister, of course, started in a different position to where he's ended. He's sending Typhoon jets to Qatar today. We appear to be all in with what the government is describing as a defensive action. But the initial decision was not to allow the use of British bases. And you said this morning that the Prime Minister acted with the support of a majority of your colleagues. In the initial decision not to allow the use of basis, were you in the majority or the minority?
Oh, well, I'm not going to, lift the veil on conversations that happen at the National Security Council. I think that those discussions
initially, did you support the idea that we should not allow the use of bases?
Those discussions are confidential. I'm not going to give a commentary on what has been discussed at the highest levels regarding our national security. What I will say is I absolutely support the position the Prime Minister has taken, and I think he's made the right decision, the right call, safeguarding the British national interest, and doing so now in order to protect our own citizens.
All right. Well, look, yesterday, 87 Iranian sailors were killed by an American torpedo. That happened thousands of miles from Iran. In what world is that a defensive measure?
Well, that is for the Americans to set out their basis for the action that they are taking. We are involved in the defensive action in a limited way because we are trying to obviously keep our own citizens safe and our own personnel safe. Of course, this is a theatre of war, and there is a lot that is happening that we are not in control of, that are not decisions made by us, and it is for the Americans to
We think that was a bad decision, don't we?
It is for the Americans to explain their decision. As I say, it's a fast-moving situation.
We wouldn't support that decision.
It's not an action we have taken.
It's not an action that we as a country, that British forces would take?
No, it's not an action that we have taken. This is not what we are doing in this theatre of war that has opened up. We are absolutely doing everything we can to keep our people, our personnel safe.
In your direct line of responsibility, the security of people here at home is highest, I guess. Has the attack on Iran placed British people here in greater danger?
Look, I think there's always been a threat. We've discussed in the past the threat posed by some hostile states to us in this country, including Iran. The security service and the police have, well practiced protocols and, capability in order to keep our country safe. It's difficult to say at this point whether that is inflaming tensions here at home or whether the threat has increased. Of course, much will depend now on how the regime is reacting and what other actions and steps they take. What I can assure people is that we are monitoring this extremely closely. I'm in regular contact with the security services and counter-terror policing in this country, and this is something that we are very alive to.
There's one other potential consequence here. In the past decade, 62,000 Iranians have applied for asylum in the United Kingdom. Pretty much whatever happens, there will be refugees. We granted 2/3 of those who applied asylum. It is very likely that there will be a flood. 26,000 came on small boats between 2018 and 2024. We received more Iranian asylum seekers than any other European country. Are we ready for what comes next?
Well, again, this is a fast-moving situation. Of course, whenever a conflict breaks out anywhere in the world, you do see a movement of people trying to get to a place of greater safety. We will now need to monitor what happens as people might seek to leave Iran, and that will mostly depend on how long the conflict goes on for, and also whatever comes next. Who can predict today what the future of that regime is going to be, whether there's going to be a change or not? I think that will dictate, actually, whether Iran is a safe place in the future or a less safe place in the future. All I can say is, like other countries in Europe, we are looking at that closely. We are very aware that if there is a big movement of people, of course, that's going to have an effect across Europe, including here at home in the UK.
Well, let's turn to that issue of immigration. In your speech today, you said that a Labour immigration policy, and this is what you set out today, you say is a Labour immigration policy, and it means, in your mind, that people like your parents who play by the rules can find a home in this country, and that their children can, and this is an interesting word, their children can unthinkingly call themselves English. Do you personally, without reservation or hesitation, call yourself English?
Yes. That's why I put that in the speech, because it's never occurred to me that I'm not. I very much identify with being somebody who's a Brummie. I think Birmingham is one of the best of the English cities, and I consider myself English as well as British as well. I know that sometimes people use English to mean slightly different things, but for me, my identity, being someone who's born and lived in England all my life, that's who I am.
So, in minority homes, generally speaking, English usually means white. From your point of view, you've gone past that. I
think definitely when I was younger, everybody would have said if you're saying someone is English, what you really mean is they're white. I think that is a little bit less true today, as more of us are settled in England. As you've seen the rise of sort of Scottish civic identity and Welsh civic identity. If England were playing Scotland in a football match, I know who I'm supporting. I wouldn't even think twice about supporting anyone other than England.
And if they're playing Pakistan at cricket?
Exactly the same, England all the way. So because of that, I think over the last few years, you've seen more of a sense of confidence amongst minority communities to consider themselves English. But also, I think English is not a race identity so much as it is a civic and national identity, and that is definitely the perspective I have of it.
An aspect of this is culture. If I may ask you a personal question. You do not cover your hair. When you came in here, you shook my hand. There will be people in your own constituency who regard this as conduct unbecoming in a woman. What do you say to those people?
Well, look, I think they're wrong. Islam as a religion, much like politics, is very contested in terms of what the requirements of faith are and how the faith should be practiced. I've always respected women who cover their head, who wear a headscarf. I think that that's a personal choice for women to make. When I was younger, I went through phases of wearing a headscarf and then not wearing one, and then wearing one again as an adult. I've not worn one. I've made that choice for myself. So I respect freedom of choice, but also freedom of conscience, because lots of...
When you say you made that choice, by the way, if may I ask you,
Yeah.
it's not just a fashion statement, is it?
No.
What does it mean?
I think for women that cover their hair, it's part of, it's an act of faith. It's an act of fidelity to the rules of modest dressing in faith.
And the decision not to wear.
And I happen to believe you can show fidelity to the teachings of modesty in dress without having to cover your hair as well. So there is a difference. The theology here is contested. I may well be in a minority view, but I've always respected people's individual freedoms of conscience. You know, different Muslims will have different ways of practicing. Some are very orthodox, maybe, or you could use the words ultra-orthodox to describe, you know, behaviour where a woman wouldn't shake hands with a man. I've respected the freedom that people have to make that choice for themselves, but that is not something I think is required in order to.
So you never sign up to ban the burqa movement.
I don't think it's the state's job in this country to be telling women what to wear, either to, uncover or cover up. You know, women can decide for themselves how they wear, what they wear and how they conduct themselves.
One other aspect of your background, you grew up, you say, watching your dad buy supplies to restock your mum's corner shop. You are not the first British politician to learn her values in a corner shop. Thrift, hard work, patriotism. Do you identify with Margaret Thatcher in any way?
Well, look, I've always said that, I have personally always admired strong women in politics, regardless of where they come from. But the interesting thing here is, of course, Margaret Thatcher's background, which is similar to mine in this regard, led her to a very different politics to mine. So I think you can learn. I certainly learned a lot from, my family having a small business, from serving customers in the corner shop. It's where I get my absolute irritation about people who describe shop theft as petty crime. You know, having been in a family that's been on the receiving end of that, I know that there's nothing petty about it when people come and nick stuff from your shop, causing you economic damage and, making you feel less safe in your own home. So there are things I've learned from that experience. Absolutely the value of money. I also come from an immigrant background, so, saving and things like that are very big in the immigrant community as well. So I'm very much a product of that upbringing.
One of the reasons I'm asking you about this background of being an immigrant, you talked about your father teaching you, who was chairman of the Birmingham Labour Party, teaching you the values of equality, decency, tolerance. You paint this picture of hard-working, patriotic immigrants contributing to community. This morning, you said this: "We have never in the history of this country had so much low-skilled migration in so little time, that there are ever longer waits for the 1.3 million people on the social housing list, and yet more pressure on the NHS. And there's strain on public services like housing and healthcare." Isn't somebody reasonable to say that you, of all people, are blaming immigrants for housing shortages and NHS waiting lists?
No, it's not the immigrants' fault. It's the previous government who allowed
you connect these two things directly.
But look, the previous government allowed an uncontrolled pattern of migration that we've never seen in this country. Today, 1 in 30 of the people who are currently in this country today arrived in the last 4 years. We've seen a faster pace of migration between 2022 and 24, so just in those few years, than we saw in the previous 4 decades. Now, no government can look at that pace of change and think that that hasn't had an impact. Our constituents are telling us it's had an impact. It's been noticed. And I don't think you can have a policy where you have such a fast pace of change of a kind we've never seen before. Something happening in 4 years now that we never had in 40 years before. That's a big change. And I think it is right to then interrogate what as a matter of public policy you do about that.
Some of your colleagues would say it is just wrong in principle to associate the pressures on the public service, the difficulties that people have with immigrants. And that in itself is wrong and prejudiced and even racist.
No, I'm afraid I don't agree with that, because, of course, it's self-evident. Look, if you had worker shortages of between 6,000 and 40,000 people, and actually 616,000 people came, that is not, anything like what the country was expecting would happen, even at the top end, right? So when 616,000 people arrive in the country, half of whom are dependents, you have to ask yourself a question, is that were we set up to do that? You have to have a pace of migration that you're able to absorb without compromising social cohesion and the integrity of our communities and the strength of our public services. So it is a numbers game. And if you have such massive numbers of a kind we've never seen before in a very short period of time, when you weren't set up to be able to handle all of that, of course you're going to see pressure. Telling people that there isn't pressure is sort of telling them that the evidence of their own eyes and what they see in their own local communities isn't true. And I'm afraid that is a mistake. So what I am doing is I'm acknowledging that a public policy decision was made, and actually what happened was far out of what was expected to happen. And of course, that now demands a new response.
Some of your colleagues come in here and they say to me that parties to the right, particularly, and need conservative reform and so on, are wrong to associate the problems of public services with the phenomenon of immigration, that immigration is in itself a good thing, we need to stop the cheating, but essentially do not blame immigrants for public services.
It's not a blame.
You are specifically linking them.
But it's not a blame game, but what it is a recognition of additional pressure. So our public services, look, I'm a Labour politician. For 14 years, the Tories have, ruined our public services. Much of what we inherited as a new government in terms of public services, they're on their knees. They're on the edge of disaster. When I walked into the Ministry of Justice, our prisons were just about ready to, run out of prison places. So we have inherited public services that are on their knees. You can accept that, and it's also true at the same time that an uncontrolled level of migration where you were expecting a smaller set of numbers and you had many, many multiples more than that, that is going to add additional pressure. And you do have to be able to run a system where your public services can meet the scale of the population and the demography that you have.
All right, let's talk about what you're going to do about it. You've announced today that you're offering £40,000 of taxpayers' money to families of failed asylum seekers who agree to go quietly, not contest their deportation, an idea that you've got from Denmark. But what is the possible moral justification for handing a sum greater than the median disposable income in British households, you can see it here, to people who have broken the law? Well, how is that moral?
We've got to enforce our law. Look, I know it sticks in the craw of people, and it's not something that you feel absolutely automatically comfortable with. But let me explain why this is the right thing to do. We already incentivise people with a small sum of money to leave the country because it's the cheapest option by a long way. So as a family of three living in a hotel...
They get £2,500.
Yeah, at the moment up to £2,500. A family of three costs us £158,000 a year to house them in a hotel, in an asylum hotel. That is a huge sum of money that we're spending every single year because these families are not, we're not able to return them to their home country. So what I've announced is a pilot where we're going to test this new approach, small set of families who are failed asylum seekers. They've exhausted all of their appeal rights, have got no right to be in this country. We will offer them this set of money in order to, as you say, go quietly, to leave and return to their home country. If they don't, they will face an enforced removal.
Viewers will say, this is the cost-benefit analysis, the spreadsheet, trumping what is moral. You cannot give people money for doing the wrong thing.
The most moral thing is actually enforcing our rules in the first place. I've inherited a system where we have a bunch of rules, but we basically never enforce them. So these families, for example, have no right to remain in our country. They've exhausted all of their appeal rights. So for many of them, the countries they come from are safe for us to return to, and yet we don't return them, primarily because we don't wish to enforce the return of children. That is a policy choice, which I'm reversing.
But the taxpayers now paying for your failure to enforce the borders.
No. What the taxpayers paying for is to make sure there's a saving of getting them out of asylum accommodation so that we stop spending many multiples more on their accommodation. And again, that is much higher than the median earnings of people in our country. So we're already spending astonishing sums of money holding these families in asylum accommodation. We've got to at least try to get them to move, and otherwise we will enforce a removal. Now, an enforced removal takes more time and costs more money. So there is a cost-benefit, but in that there is a morality too, because we do need these people to leave this country, and we should make savings.
I want to come to the enforcement, but before I get to that, I want to put something which I think a lot of your colleagues in the House will find uncomfortable. You're not the first to propose this sort of incentive. Here are the words of another West Midlands MP. He said, immigrants in my own constituency from time to time come to me asking if I can find them assistance to return home. And he called for a re-immigration policy to be adopted and pursued with determination. Enoch Powell, 1968, Rivers of Blood. That's going to horrify some of your fellow MPs.
This is not about some sort of re-immigration programme. This is failed asylum-seeking families. They've come to this country, they've sought asylum. They've sought to be...
It's still paying people to go away.
They've sought to have refugee status. Their claims have been heard. They've been appealed. They've had multiple appeal attempts. They've failed in all of them. The courts have upheld that they are not refugees. They are not legitimate asylum seekers. They have no right to be in this country. Those are the people that we are targeting. And what I would say is, look, to my colleagues, your viewers, people across the country, the important thing here is we have a set of rules. If you have exhausted your appeal rights, you are supposed to leave this country because you've got no right to be here. We are not enforcing our own rules at the moment. This change is designed to enforce our rules, incentivise it to begin with, but if they don't do that, they will face an enforced removal.
Well, let's look at what enforcement really means. You say that in Denmark, 95% go voluntarily, but there's still 5% who don't. 5 years ago, Home Office tried to deport 2 Indian brothers living in Glasgow, been there for 10 years. Hundreds of neighbours came out in protest, and in the end, the men had to be released. Are you prepared to see that kind of chaos all over the country?
Well, look, we are talking about failed asylum-seeking families in asylum accommodation. And what I would say to people is when people have no right to be in this country, you do have to enforce that. Otherwise, you might as well run an open borders
You'll say that,
policy.
but the people who live next door to Mrs. Ali, whose son or daughter's been in class with them for 5 years, are going to be saying, these are good citizens. What are you doing? Well,
look, firstly, I would say that actually all of our proposals have a plurality of support across the country. People understand that we are running a broken system at the moment where much of our rules are not enforced properly, where, we haven't interrogated the settlement rules and what that really buys you and what is the price of being able to live forever in this country. So it is right that we look at all of these changes. And I think people do recognise, what's happening is these people have no right to be here and we still keep paying anyway. And we keep paying very large sums of money. And I do think people understand.
My point is that sounds fine sitting here. But if you follow your policy through, you only have to look across to the Atlantic to see what it means in practice. What it means in practice is pictures on the telly at 6 o'clock of children being put in vehicles, their mothers being handcuffed, entire families being forced into planes. Are you ready to be the Home Secretary who enforces that? Because in the end, that's what happens.
Well, look, there is a difference between the approach taken in other countries and the approach taken here. We have already got removals from this country,
but people
including
don't want to go.
If you let me finish. We've already got enforced removals as well as voluntary removals up under this government. We're just under 60,000 people have been removed and returned from this country already. So we are already day in, day out actually engaging in immigration enforcement. It is a common thing. People do see it in their communities. Of course, I do understand that, the situation in relation to families is different. That is why we are seeking to incentivise people to take the money and to return home. If they don't take that money, of course, we do have to move to an enforced removal. And what I would say to you is, what is the answer then if you don't do this that people have, which is the cost to the taxpayer goes up, and we essentially allow people to remain regardless of how they've come in this country and whether they have a right to be in this country in the first place. In the end, ordinary working people are picking up the tab for that. And I do think people have recognised that unless we take, a stronger approach on enforcement, we don't have a migration control system to speak of.
To be clear, though, I mean, this is a human level. We're talking about children being put in the back of vans, screaming, frightened by people who may not want to do it, but have been told by you, they've got to do it. That's what you're saying.
Look, we're currently consulting on the way that we would enforce. And of course, we already have arrangements in this country, legal arrangements about how we would handle children, whether that's in a school setting, whether that's with the police, whether that's in, other parts of public service. So there are already well-used rules about the way that we approach the handling of children. And of course, we would want to do this as humanely and as effectively as possible.
when the police come knocking on the door, there's no humane
This is about immigration enforcement,
it's
and
terrifying.
it's about being in a process where you are able to enforce your rules. And as I say, if you don't do that, the flip side is you just end up picking up the tab for hundreds of families, hundreds of thousands of pounds per family every single year, and it is the taxpayer in the end that's paying the price of that. So there is no easy solution here. But if you're going to have rules, then you better enforce them. Otherwise, you might as well say to everybody, there's no rules enforced at all. It's an open border situation. And I don't think that has public support either.
You talked about taxpayer picking up the tab, and you're promising to end the obligation to support asylum seekers. No benefits, no accommodation, who failed. No benefits, no accommodation. People sleeping in the streets, working cash in hand. More work for the police, more people in the prisons that, when in your last job, you were telling us are completely full. Is that the outcome?
No, this is designed to essentially make people comply with our rules. When you have a flat duty, so in all circumstances you have this duty to provide asylum support, that's a remnant of EU law that we had retained, which we are now removing. So we're going to move to a system where we have a power. We can choose who we provide asylum support to and who we don't. We obviously don't want to leave people destitute, but we currently have something like, we estimate, 10% of asylum seekers who are in asylum accommodation paid for by taxpayers, by your viewers, who actually have the right to work because of the route that they came in on. I think it's right that as we move forward away from this flat duty, we say to those people, well, if you already had the right to work, you came into this country saying you could support yourself, you are now expected to support yourself, and that we retain the asylum accommodation that we provide, paid for by the taxpayer, for those who really need it. So I think it is right that we move to a system where we ask more of the people that can support themselves. And of course, if you break our rules and you break our laws, then I don't think you should qualify for that asylum support. We want people to comply, and this is a way of enforcing that.
But I still don't see how you prevent this being, the outcome of this being people sleeping on the street because you've removed their support.
Well, look, people have to make some choices here. Currently, people come and they know that they will have asylum support paid for automatically. I think us saying, actually, in future, it's not automatic. And by the way, not that dissimilar to British citizens who, when they are applying for housing through their local council, if they are deemed to have made themselves intentionally homeless, they don't apply for that accommodation either. So I don't think that, people in our asylum-supported accommodation should be in a more privileged position when it comes to rights and responsibilities than asylum seekers.
I noticed that in your speech, you talk about the intent of the 1951 Refugee Convention. You want to get rid of it, don't you?
No, we are in the Refugee Convention.
You don't say we're going to comply with the 1951 Refugee Convention. You say specifically twice that you want to stick to the intent of it.
Yes, well, look, law is regularly contested, but it is possible for us to take a different approach in line with what we've seen other countries do, Germany, Switzerland, Denmark, having a smaller period of leave, a much more temporary system, in compliance with international law. The approaches that we've already seen that are similar to ours in other countries are countries that are in the Refugee Convention.
All right. One other thing, you are going to make it easier for people on higher incomes to get indefinite leave to remain relative to others. So someone who earns more than £100,000 get to apply for indefinite leave to remain years earlier than someone earning £40,000, and with it they get access to benefits and the NHS and so on. When did it become Labour policy to make life easier for rich people than for ordinary people?
This is a system of economic migration, and I think it's right that we look at settlement and the way in which you earn the right to live here for free. So, of course, we should look at contribution. And what we have proposed is not just for higher earners, but also those in public service roles, where we might choose to give some people in particular jobs a quicker path to settlement. It's a new contribution model that we have proposed. Some people will earn that right at 5 years, maybe even as low as 3. Others will have to wait longer. And, of course, if you are reliant on benefits, or if you have not got a clean criminal record, for example, all of these things will add on time to your ability to settle in this country forever. I think it's right that we move to a contribution model, and that's what we propose. OK,
so on the incentives, on the forcible removals, you've talked about visas today, on the indefinite leave to remain, you're pretty determined. You're not going to back off. The big question is, can you actually get it done? You said in your speech, I'm quoting here, hard-working people see a state that they pay taxes towards unable to stop a flow of dinghies across the channel while paying billions towards hotels. If we cannot deal with so visible a failure, what can the state achieve at all? In fact, lots of people would say that. You've got all these ambitious plans, but you can't even stop some boats coming across the channel. How do we expect all of these things to happen? And we've had more arrive today.
Yeah, look,
hundreds of people.
And I think that the current situation is unacceptable. Obviously, I'm working very hard to try and stop that flow of.
But whatever your intent, the reality is here it is. You're the tough Home Secretary. These people should know Shabana Mahmood's after you. They don't care. They're getting on the boat.
But look, there's no... would that there were a magic wand and I could make that go away overnight, or a silver bullet that would just sort all of this out. There isn't that. What there is a proper approach. It will take some time to deliver. We are seeking to reduce the incentives, to change the calculus of those who are getting on those boats in the first place, as well as obviously our cooperation with France and other countries.
2 years in, and your colleagues were coming in here week after week telling me you're going to smash the gangs. The gangs are massively unsmashed. You haven't got a machine that can do what you want it to do.
No, so our cooperation with the French in particular has actually led to 5,000 law enforcement disruptions of the gang activity, so stopping people from being able to get others on a boat. We've stopped 40,000 crossings since we've been in government. Obviously, it's not enough, and it's not going far enough, and it's not working at the moment. We do have to go further. I think that the range of law enforcement responses that we are taking, as well as the policies that I've announced to reduce the incentives of people who are seeking to get on a boat, reducing the leave you get, reducing the entitlements that come with that. I think that taken together is part of the picture of how we solve this crisis. But I wish that, there isn't one silver bullet. We have to do everything together and roll it all out, and then I believe it will start to have an effect.
So we can expect by the end of this summer that we're not going to be seeing those scenes of small boats arriving?
Look, I can't say to you that that's going to happen immediately, but over the course of this Parliament, as I roll out...
At least promise me they're going to go down.
Well, look, we are doing everything we can to get these numbers down, and, we are taking more law enforcement action. We've got more cooperation with countries where the boats and the equipment is actually made and put together, as well as where it is actually stored, and then right down to where people are using it to get in. We are working across all of this. It's not going to be quick. It's not easy. It does take time, but I do believe we can get there.
But Home Secretary, this is why people don't have faith. They went up and up and up, small boat arrivals, 2023. Then you got elected, and your predecessor, Yvette Cooper, said to me month after month, she was in here, saying, we're going to smash the gangs, we're going to stop it and all the rest of it. Graph's still going up. Did she fail?
No, it takes time. Look, I'm building on the work that Yvette did when she was Home Secretary. She's the one that got the cooperation with France in a much better place. She's the one that helped to, basically unblock the system. What the Tories had left behind was all sorts of people waiting, thousands of them in the queue just to have their initial decision made. Obviously, she was able to turn that around. I do recognise that it is incredibly frustrating for people because all of these different answers to different bits of the problem are going to take time. But the combination of the measures, once fully rolled out, I believe will fix this problem.
Let's talk about the politics of this. Last year, the Prime Minister made a speech which came to be called the Island of Strangers speech. Rehearse some of the themes that you've been talking about today. Within days, after an outcry, Labour MP saying he's using racist language, he just repudiated it. Your biggest obstacle is going to come in persuading your own party to back you, won't it?
Look, I think that the proposals that I've announced have strong and majority support in the Parliamentary Labour Party. Of course, there will be colleagues that have concerns or are dead set against it. It is a democracy and people will have their own views.
Indeed, some of them were saying last week that the loss in Gorton and Denton was because you're being too tough on immigration. I understand that you had a letter from 100 Labour MPs complaining that your proposals are basically un-Labour and you need to back off. What's your message to those people?
Well, firstly, on our by-election defeat, I've been around for 16 years now in frontline politics, and in every by-election, people trot up and say, this by-election proves something I personally believe for a long time, and therefore I'm right. I would really caution people against trying to suggest that they can read that by-election. And my understanding, actually, of the nuances of that result is that actually, Labour came third in some of the white working class class areas, as well as not doing well in the ethnic minority areas, or where actually some of our vote held up. So I think there's a lot of people that are trying to use that result to prosecute their own personal politics. It doesn't bear any resemblance to the result and what it actually shows about patterns of voting and behaviour that sit underneath that. There are lessons for us to learn from that by-election, but it isn't. I think placing the blame at that door, I would really, really reject. I'd also caution people against sort of trying to put all ethnic minority communities in one big block, and as if they themselves are now self-appointed spokespeople for millions and millions of ethnic minority voters. Ethnic minority communities, as you and I think both know, being members of ethnic minority communities, have just the same plurality of views and multiple different opinions as you know, their white counterparts. So this proves the thing I always believed is just rubbish.
So what
I don't accept that at all.
So what are you saying to your colleagues on the back benches who are saying, Shabana, this is not Labour, this is not what we stand for, we need to be more open, not ape the reform?
Well, look, I've been making that case today. These are Labour reforms because this is the Labour Party using our values of fairness, of compassion, but also wanting to be firm in our rules and to have a controlled system in order to build public support for having either an asylum system at all or a migration system at all. The extremes of politics, you know, whether you've got the open borders brigade of the Green Party or the closed borders brigade, those are at the extremes.
They don't think you're sitting in the middle. They think that what you're doing is looking over your shoulder at Nigel Farage. You're taking a tonking from him in Labour seats, and they say that what you're trying to do is to get in front of Nigel Farage, but you will never out-reform reform.
They couldn't be more wrong. These are Labour. I'm a Labour Home Secretary, and I have brought forward Labour proposals. I can see a problem. I'm trying to privilege fairness in this new system. I want people to play by the rules. I would hope that all of my party can accept that, you know, playing by the rules, following the law of our land is like a basic requirement that we should expect of people, and we should stand firm in that. These are basic Labour principles about following rules, privileging those who play by the rules, encouraging contribution, rewarding those who work, asking for people to be able to speak English. This is very much in the centre ground of what the Labour Party should be offering, and I believe is supported by a plurality of voters across the country as well.
By the way, just deal with the social media memes, which are probably already going, which says, we know what she's about. She's wearing turquoise, she's wearing reform blue already.
Oh, for God's sake. Well, when the first set of these memes came along, I did say, over my dead body. I stand by that. I am Labour through and through. I know what I stand for. I know why I'm in the Labour Party, and I know why the Labour Party has to be the party that is able to resolve the problems in our migration and asylum systems so that we retain public support and confidence for having those systems in the first place.
Let me ask you about what I think may be the most difficult thing for people watching. Prime Minister's obviously assured you of his backing. Prime Minister, by our reckoning, has executed at least a dozen, possibly 15 U-turns. He backed the winter fuel cut, then he didn't. He backed inheritance tax on farmers, then he didn't. He backed mandatory ID cards, then he didn't. He agreed with you on Iran, I think, and then he didn't. And now he's thrown his closest advisor under the bus. Do you trust him to be there for you next week when the going gets tough?
Yes, I do. I've discussed these reforms with the Prime Minister at length, not just today or last week, but for months now since I've been in post. We have had long discussions about what the right thing to do is on both asylum policy and on migration policy. So yes, I have absolute confidence.
Was he OK with what you were going to say, knowing that people would interpret this as your leadership pitch?
Well, I think people are over-reading that. This is my pitch as a Labour Home Secretary to build public confidence in a Labour-run asylum system.
But it's a signal of what kind of leader you would be, isn't it?
Well, I think that, look, people are going to, you know, have all of that commentary. I've shown before, and I've spoken to you before about the fact that I have no time for any of that. I have quite a lot on my plate as the Home Secretary. I've got a big job to do, and that's the only thing I'm focused on.
That's a rather interesting sentence. You have no time for this. I would have put the word ambitions into that sentence if I wasn't keen on it.
No, I am focused on the job of being Home Secretary, and I think probably only former Home Secretaries can understand what I'm saying when I say this, which is there is a lot on your plate when you're the Home Secretary, and it doesn't, you know, that is the only thing I'm focused on. That is what I care about, being a good Home Secretary. That's why these reforms are so important.
Last point. Before you became an MP, you made a very successful career as a professional indemnity lawyer. You were protecting doctors and others who run into trouble in the course of their work. In politics, there's no such thing as professional indemnity.
No.
If you fail, you fail. You're making a career-defining gamble today. What happens if you gamble and you lose? What will you do?
Well, firstly, it's not so much about my career, it's about the country. Honestly, when I go into work every day, what I care about is fixing the problems in our country and having a system our country can have confidence in. The country comes first all the time. And in the end, it is the country that will decide. These reforms will either succeed and build confidence in the country, or they won't, or the country might reject the Labour Party if we don't do this. So I think in the end, it is always the country that decides. But I can assure your viewers, the only thing I ever think about when I go to work every single day as the Home Secretary is what is the right thing to do for our country.